Well, if you or someone you love are one of the 1 in 100 people living with schizophrenia, a part of your brain may hold the key to a new treatment. Now, Professor Brian Dean is head of the Molecular Psychiatry Laboratory at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience. Professor, good afternoon to you.
Hello.
Good to talk with you. Now, you've spent the last 25 years of your life working on this particular area, but I guess for many of us who aren't that familiar, can you just explain what is schizophrenia? Because I think a lot of us have perhaps the wrong view of what it is.
Yes, so schizophrenia is still defined by the presentation of a series of symptoms. Most people would identify it through the symptoms of delusions and hallucinations, which are known as the positive symptoms. But with the disease as well, there are what's called the negative symptoms, and these are the symptoms that cause a person with schizophrenia to withdraw socially. And then probably the most debilitating symptoms are the cognitive symptoms, which makes it nearly impossible for them to function very well on a day-to-day basis. So it's this spectrum of diseases. Often people thought it was this split personality that you see in the media, but it isn't that. It's quite a distinct psychiatric illness.
But obviously covers a range of different presentations, so it may not always look exactly the same.
Exactly right. I mean, it still takes a skilled psychiatrist. I'm a biochemist, so I don't do this, but it takes a skilled psychiatrist to diagnose the disorder properly. And so, it's really something that can be quite difficult to diagnose. And one of the problems we have is the later it's diagnosed, the worse it is for the patient. So early diagnosis is one of the things that people are trying to work towards.
And I mentioned 1 in 100 people. Is that the right figures? And that, I mean, if that's true, that would suggest it's not as perhaps uncommon as we might think.
No, it's very true, and it's interesting. It's pretty much the same over all the socioeconomic groups. It's the same in the northern and southern hemisphere. It's a little bit higher in industrialized societies than it is in non-industrialized societies, and nobody really knows why that occurs. And then in the odd place you get the cluster of higher levels. There's one in Southern Ireland, which is presumably due to an increase in genetic susceptibility in that part of the world.
Now, Professor, you mentioned you're a biochemist, not a psychiatrist.
That's correct.
And you are working at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience. And over the last more than a couple of decades, you've been particularly focused on one particular brain receptor when it comes to schizophrenia. Why is that? What is it about this particular brain receptor?
So this particular brain receptor, how this came about was many years ago, a group of us in Melbourne decided that one way forward to study schizophrenia would be to collect brains post-mortem from people with the disorder and compare the biochemistry of those brains to that in control individuals. And one of the first molecules that we got into is known as the Muscarinic M1 Receptor. And we thought that molecule would be very important in the cause of schizophrenia because it's potent in regulating our cognitive abilities. And if you recall, cognitive deficits are one of the most debilitating symptoms of the disease. So really that was the reason why we started to study that receptor.
And what are you thinking that this receptor does when it comes to schizophrenia?
Well, the idea would be that this receptor would be changed in the brains of people with schizophrenia, and that change would be contributing to the cognitive deficits. And indeed, when we first looked at this receptor in the brains of people with this disorder way back in 1995, what we showed was there were lower levels of the muscarinic M1 receptor in the brains of people with schizophrenia. They're not lower in the brains of people who have depression, and they're not lower in the brains of people who have bipolar disorder.
And so what is that? Is that responding to levels of something else in the brain that it's receiving from, those signals? We've
been trying to find that out for 25 years. Recently, we've found a couple of molecules like apolipoprotein E that we think may be involved in driving down levels of that receptor. But the other interesting finding we've made is that there's changes in the methylation of the promoter of the receptor, and that sounds like double Dutch to most people. But what methylation of a promoter of a receptor means is that that receptor is open to environmental modulation. So factors in the environment that we encounter could actually be driving down levels of the receptor in the brain as well. And we know that schizophrenia is a disease where environment and genetics interact to cause the disorder.
So let me just see if I've got this right. Are we saying that this receptor then is lower in people, in the brains of people who had schizophrenia than it is for other conditions, but we just don't know what's causing that lowering at this point?
Yes, and if I've got another 25 years on the planet, I might find out.
You must have a couple of ideas, though, Professor.
Well, the really my thoughts in all this from the very beginning were, I'm not likely to cure schizophrenia, but I might be able to help in developing drugs to treat the disorder. So when we actually discovered there were low levels of muscarinic receptors in the brains of people with schizophrenia, what we started to advocate was that what we need to do is stimulate the receptors that are there with a drug. And
so that those levels increase, is that what you're saying?
No, so a receptor works at two levels. First of all, the number of receptors in your brain dictates the level, but also how things like drugs can activate those receptors, modulate the outcome. So if you can activate more, let's say you have 100 receptors and normally 60% of them are activated, you can use a drug and activate 80% of those receptors and you get a better response. So the argument was that we should develop drugs that actually activate the M1 receptor to treat schizophrenia, and that would help overcome some of the deficient activation of the receptors.
Now, that genetic and environmental mix that you're talking about, is that true of other mental health conditions, or is it sort of unique to schizophrenia?
No, increasingly we think it's true for depression and bipolar disorder as well. So the argument that people put forward is that someone inherits a genetic susceptibility for the disease, and then they encounter, we don't know all these environmental factors, but for example, a difficult birth is thought to be one. And the combination of the impact of that environment and insult and your genetics causes you to get the disorder. And the reason why we think this is true is if you look at the monozygotic twin of someone with schizophrenia, for example, the likelihood of them having the disease is less than 50%. Whereas if you look at the monozygotic twin of somebody with Huntington's chorea, which is a genetic disease, they will get the disorder. So that's what's telling us that schizophrenia or other psychiatric disorders isn't all about genetics.
Okay. If we don't know everything about this receptor, do we know the environmental conditions that trigger it?
No. We've been studying that as well. We've looked at whether drug treatment or drugs of abuse might affect levels of this receptor, because we know that a lot of young people are exposed to such things, and we can't find anything yet that in fact causes marked changes in the levels of that receptor, and that's some of the things we're still exploring.
Yeah. So after 25 years researching this particular receptor, the muscarinic, is that how you say it?
Muscarinic, yep.
Muscarinic receptor. Have you been able to develop a treatment that kind of broadly treats that receptor if we can't get to the specifics yet?
Well, that's I haven't done it, but what this shows is that, research is two things. Long term, if you're going to get any good outcomes, and there needs to be an interaction between academics and industry to get drugs made to improve the lots of people with schizophrenia. So what happened was, when we start to publish data on muscarinic M1 receptor deficiencies in the brain of people with schizophrenia, a drug company actively started to develop muscarinic receptor agonists. And I'm pleased to say that very late last year, a late phase 2 trial published data showing that their muscarinic M1 receptor agonist decreased the positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia quite substantially. So that is a proof of principle that what we argued all those years ago is true. And now what has to happen is that drug has to get through a phase 3 trial, which is the last trial in its step to getting into the clinic. It's not a small step, it's a big step. But having said that, 98% of drugs don't pass the phase 2 trial. So this is quite exciting news.
That is exciting for people who live with schizophrenia and their families. I'm talking with Professor Brian Dean. He's head of the Molecular Psychiatry Laboratory at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience. And we're looking at his 25 years of work at this particular brain receptor that they believe is key to developing a potential new treatment for schizophrenia. Just going back to that receptor specifically, Professor, as you work out, how do you go about working out what is triggering that receptor in the brain? You've been working on this for a long time. So, I mean, how many things are there in the brain that could be triggering it, and how do you rule some in and some out, so to speak?
That's the real problem. So as far as we're aware, there are several hundred molecules in the brain that regulate levels of this receptor. And so what we've been doing for 20-odd years is trying to find the molecules that actually might be regulating the expression of the receptor. And what this really involves is looking at what molecules the brain makes and how their levels change in schizophrenia, and therefore how they could affect the level of receptor. And how we've gone about this most recently is using new technology which allows us to look at, instead of one molecule at a time, we're now looking at 15,000 molecules at a time. And from that, we are beginning to build up the biochemistry of how the M1 receptor is regulated in the brain, and whether or not within that pathway there might be more sites for drugs to treat schizophrenia. So that's what we're actually doing at the moment.
Well, you know, you've been working on this for a very long time and still don't have many of the answers, Professor. It shows what a lifetime of work it involves to get to the bottom of these questions. Are you confident that you will see an answer or a treatment for schizophrenia in your lifetime?
Yeah, I think the latest data I've seen on this new drug, yes, I am. But one of the other things that we've been able to do, which is also very exciting, is, and I never expected to do this in my lifetime, is with scientists at the Austin Hospital, we've actually been able to develop over the last 7 years a radioligand that we can use in an imaging system, so we can actually see this receptor in the living brain, which gives us a whole new vista of how we can study this receptor in brains of people with schizophrenia. And, that again opens up how we can ask the questions around what in our environment, what in our genetics is actually affecting the levels of this receptor in the brains of people with schizophrenia.
It's fascinating, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Professor Brian Dean, head of the Molecular Psychiatry Laboratory at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience. Every time we do one of these brain power segments, it always blows me away how much we know about the brain, but also how little we know about the brain. It is.